Okie dokie. So yesterday we were talking about how in some of those movies and stories and TV shows in particular, you can get those redemption arcs where it seems like somebody really screwed something up and you're like, man, I don't like you very much. But then something happens and it flips around and you're like, oh, okay, well, now I get it. You got restored by the authors. You're put back in a good place. And now we're going to track with you as the story moves forward. And some of those movies or TV shows, you even get a thing where the characters that you didn't like very much end up taking the torch and carrying it forward. I can think of some awesome epic storytelling, long form, premium TV kind of situations where a really likable, very important, influential main character dies in the early going, and then a character that you weren't really warm to yet, they're all that's left, and they end up becoming what you follow and what you root for moving forward. Likewise, that's what we get with Peter if we look at the totality of the New Testament. If we just look at Matthew, as we discussed last time around, I think we have to agree it's a little bit ambiguous, at least at first glance, what we are to do in our brains with Peter as readers of this work divorced from all other context. Now, again, as we discussed last time around, I think with a tiny bit closer look and a little bit more time to think, you can figure out what Matthew's doing with Peter, and you understand he's not washing his hands of him. Peter's not just a cautionary tale, but Peter, not even Peter, is good enough to be righteous enough to enter the kingdom or make the kingdom thing happen. That access is Jesus to give, and there's a righteousness that is from Jesus that can be given. We talked about all that stuff. You're tracking with what I'm saying. But all that said, where I wanted to pick up the conversation today was just with the redemption arc. We didn't get to that last time because we just stayed in Matthew. What happens when you go beyond Matthew? What is Peter's redemption arc? And here's how we can figure it out. Well, one part of Peter's redemption arc is the existence of the very next book of the New Testament, Mark. I don't know for sure off the top of my head who all connects Mark with Peter, but I know for sure that Eusebius, who is writing a couple centuries later, but quotes a whole bunch of people from earlier, including Clement of Rome. Dang it. It was Clement of Rome, wasn't it? What you're not hearing right now is that I wasn't sure on something, so I went and Googled it, but I just deleted the Googling because you didn't need to hear all of that. I was going to say, all right, I think there are just a couple of sources from the early church that suggest that Mark traveled with Peter, worked with Peter, and that Mark is a representation of Peter's reflections, memories of stuff that he saw with Jesus, sermons that he might have preached. And then I was like, I don't want to sound like a total idiot. I'm going to go Google that and just see who else said it. It was not a couple of people. This is actually really well attested in terms of the early churches. There's just universal agreement on this. Papias, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, and then Eusebius, quoting a whole bunch of people. Eusebius came later. He was a guy who wrote down the history of the church, and he had access to tons of documents and writings that we don't have anymore. So we kind of got to lean on him as being a bridge back to what generation 2, 3, and 4 of the early Christian church thought. So the point is, blah, 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 blah. Like everybody who would have known said, no, this Peter and Mark connection, it's a very real thing. So there's not much reason to doubt it. And when you look at the internal evidence in Mark, it looks like it looks like Peter's perspective. It works. There are details. We won't get into that now. Maybe someday if we do the book of Mark, we'll get into all that stuff. But the point is it in any way possible that the people who started gradually assembling the books of the Bible into a certain order, because the order isn't explicit, it's not internally obvious what order the books of the New Testament should be in or what order the Gospels should be in. Is it possible that maybe the tension we talked about last time around with Peter not having his standing being crystal clear coming out of the book of Matthew, is it possible that people looked at that and were like, well, the very fact that Mark exists is a pretty explicit affirmation and reminder of what happened next with Peter? I don't know. That's my theory. I've never heard anybody smart say that. So it is very, very much just a guess that I'm throwing out. But the existence of Mark seems to affirm that everybody accepted Peter as being a reliable witness to what went down and a very important player in what happened next. Yes, I am turning pages. Then you go over to Luke, and we get more details at the end of Luke about what happened with the resurrection account and who found out first and how Jesus revealed himself back to the disciples. We get a little bit before they all go and rendezvous up in Galilee. And one of the details we get then from Luke is that Peter found out about the resurrection and was all over it. I mean, think about his motivation here. It's not just, wow, Jesus is alive and it's all true and that changes everything about everything. There's also a very personal level for him here where it's like, the last time we talked, that didn't go so well. And then you probably heard what I did and how I denied you, and you were right about that. But he's like the prodigal son from earlier in Luke 15 here, in that Peter is less concerned in this post-resurrection account about the fact that he totally screwed everything up, and he's so confident in the character of his master, of his king, that he goes running with wild abandon right back to him. I think I'm kind of lumping in two parts of the story of the prodigal son, but I think you see what I'm doing. He goes running right back because he just knows that he'll be received. He knows that the relationship will be right. He trusts the character of the king. And then the way the rest of the last chapter of Luke 24, unfolds, we see that there's a pretty dynamic timeline that is very simplified in the last chapter of Matthew, and we'll get into all of that later. It's important, though, that this is happening in the book of Luke, because Luke opens his gospel and Luke opens his sequel, the book of Acts, that deals with what happens after the events of Jesus' life, by saying stuff like this: "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus," that's something we'll talk about later too, "so that you may know the certainty of the things that have been taught." So Luke is a historian in the style of Herodotus, the great Greek historian from centuries earlier, and he's going to go and do the work. He's going to pound pavement. He's going to ask people, and all of this is clearly happening after the fact. I think Luke and Acts were both written before 70 AD, or, I mean, he could have made Jesus look real smart by just mentioning the whole "then the temple got destroyed and Jesus was vindicated" totally thing, since vindicating Jesus is really high on Luke's agenda list in his book. So before 70 AD is my guess. He went and did this research. Well, it's still a lot of time that passed, and he went and asked people. And clearly how things were going to work out with Peter had shook out by then, and it makes perfect sense that Luke then would want to include one of the characters who really is risen to the forefront in the interim between the events being described in Luke and the time when people would first be able to read the Gospel of Luke. And so he specifically highlights in Luke 24 the details of Simon's response, whereas in terms of the theological purposes of Matthew, we don't need the details of Simon or Peter, as it were, Simon Peter's response. So Luke spells that out. It makes sense. Matthew doesn't. That also makes sense. Then we go over to John, and this is an interesting one. Where are we at time-wise? We're getting tight. I'm just going to split this one into two, and we're going to talk about what happens at the end of John. For me, in like 30 seconds. For you, it's gonna be the next episode, and it's gonna be super. Real quick note: I've gotten such nice feedback from you on the Clamor and the Crash, the album that Jeff Foote did. Jeff does all the music for this podcast. He does it under the band name Rooktown. Thank you, everybody who's listened to that and who shared it with other people. I think it's so much fun and so good. It's complex and it's thoughtful and it's listenable, and it deals with a lot of the themes that we talk about here. So if you haven't listened yet, you can go to Spotify. You can check out a link below. I get nothing for promoting this other than I take something I think is good and give it to you and point you in that direction, because I think you will enjoy it too. So thanks to Jeff for being awesome and for all the help that he provides with music and editing and other stuff that goes along with this podcast, but also for being an awesome musician who makes music that I like to listen to and that I like to share with you. The Clamor and the Crash, that's the album. It's by Rooktown, which is secretly Jeff Foote. Thank you for listening to that. More about what happened to Peter after the book of Matthew and how his redemption arc plays out through the rest of the New Testament. Mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
Sometimes a hero rises from